Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. We have a very informative program for you this evening featuring Hawa Allan talking about her new book, Insurrection, Rebellion, Civil Rights, and the Paradoxical State of Black Citizenship. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. Post a question at any point during the event, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. In the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Insurrection. Hawa is an attorney and a writer of cultural criticism, fiction, and poetry. Her work has appeared in a number of publications, and Insurrection is her first book. It's a combination of legal history and personal narrative. History looks at the use over the years of the Insurrection Act of 1807, which empowers the president to deploy U.S. military or federalized National Guard troops domestically to quell civil disturbances and reestablish order. It's been applied differently in roughly 24 instances, but all the cases, Hawa argues, have in one way or another reflected America's lasting struggle for racial equity. At times, the act was used in support of civil rights, like when President Kennedy deployed the National Guard to enforce the court-ordered desegregation of Alabama's public schools. At other times, the law was employed to stifle protests against slavery or other racial injustices. Adding a depth and immediacy to her account, Hawa incorporates personal stories. She weaves the perspectives of a number of prominent thinkers on racial justice issues with her own experiences, such as learning from her parents that some of their white neighbors on Long Island had conspired to expel Black families from the community, or working as a Black lawyer in a predominantly white firm during a visit from then presidential candidate Barack Obama. Here's what Publishers Weekly said about Hawa's book. Eloquently mixing history, autobiography, and philosophy, this powerful account sheds new light on the Black experience in America. Conversation with Hawa will be Sherally Munshi, an associate law professor at Georgetown University, whose scholarly interests include property law, immigration law, and critical legal theory. So Hawa and Sherally, the screen is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Hawa, for inviting me. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you about your book. And I just wanted to begin by inviting you to say a little bit about your interest in the Insurrection Act. As everybody knows, we're coming on the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, and you open the book with the image of Trump standing in Lafayette Plaza holding a Bible upside down, as you point out, and you conclude with the Capitol riot. But I know that you have been thinking about the Insurrection Act for a long time, long before Trump was even elected. So can you say a little bit about your early interest in this, or the genesis of your project?
Sure. So basically, I happened to stumble upon the Insurrection Act. I wasn't really looking for it. What I wanted to find out at the time where I came across it was why there was such a long time lag in the federal government's response to the Hurricane Katrina crisis. I didn't really see a satisfying answer in the news, and I was just digging and trying to figure out if there was anything more specific, anything technical that had been at play. And I found out that although the then governor of Louisiana, Kathleen Blanco, had made a formal request of then President George W. Bush, to provide federal aid through the Stafford Act, which basically sets forth legislation that facilitates the administration of federal help to state officials in the event of man-made or natural disasters. So she had, made that the requisite request, and in the context of the Stafford Act, any federal troop, army and so on and so forth that were dispatched to Louisiana would not have had any local law enforcement powers. For example, the powers to, arrest suspects or search suspects or make seizures of any evidence from suspects. They would only be able to sort of aid any local law enforcement, in Louisiana at the state and local level, but not carry out those powers themselves under the Stafford Act. So the reason why I found out that George W. Bush hesitated to dispatch federal troops pursuant to the Stafford Act is because he had heard on the ground that there was a lot of violence at the time. In New Orleans in particular, there were a lot of exaggerated rumors of, for example, roaming armed gangs and rooftop snipers, and even reports of murder and rape in the Superdome, which was the makeshift shelter for people trying to get away from the floodwaters. So it turns out those reports were largely exaggerated and even false, but at the time there was a lot of confusion around them, even to the extent that the local officials on the ground, because of the lack of communications due to the hurricane and how it had disrupted everything, they themselves were repeating these rumors. For example, Mayor Ray Nagin and Blanco herself, when she was talking about making efforts to borrow National Guard troops from nearby states, made an announcement, a publicized announcement that they had M16s that were locked and loaded, and they were ready to shoot to kill if necessary. So the tenor of the response at the state level was not necessarily, was not framed as one that was by any means or one to search and rescue. There was a sort of policing aspect to that mission at the state level in any event. But Kathleen Blanco did not want George W. Bush to invoke the Insurrection Act, largely because if that would have happened, then George W. Bush would have been the commander-in-chief of all of the National Guard troops on the ground, as well as any federal troops that were dispatched. And it was basically a federalism-based tug of war between the two officials for several days, which delayed the inevitable, provision of federal help, with troops and otherwise. So at the end of that dilemma, George W. Bush decided not to invoke the Insurrection Act, because he, as he said in his memoir, Decision Points, to invoke the Insurrection Act as a white male Republican president to a largely African American city over the objections of a white female Democrat governor, would, in the Deep South, he said specifically, would unleash holy hell. So, amid this background, I decided to look more into the Insurrection. I had never heard of the Insurrection Act. And a lot of people I had spoken to who at the time who I'd asked about it hadn't really heard of it either. It was fairly obscure, passed in 1807, on the books, but not necessarily something that's discussed very often. So in looking into it, I was surprised actually to find that the incidents that the Insurrection Act was invoked with respect to happened to be very well-known incidents in U.S. history and in particular African American history.
And I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more about that history, and again, sort of insurrection, anniversary of the insurrection in the background. You and I have spoken about this a little bit, but so much of the conversation about what happened on January 6th has sort of become sort of forensic exercise where, our focus has become sort of narrow to who was doing what, when, who can we assign responsibility to. But the history that you're telling through the Insurrection Act, as you said, passed in 1807, and its record, right, over the course of the 19th and 20th century, you through telling that history, you offer a much richer and deeper contextualization of the events that transpired last year, right? Such that they almost look like a culmination of a centuries-long history, right? And so I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about the history that you're telling, or the history, you know, the through lines that are revealed to you through your study of the Insurrection Act and its record. If you could walk us through some of the episodes you discuss in the book.
Okay, so, well, first I will preface this by saying that this inquiry was sort of done into history, was done through presidential proclamations and the subsequent executive orders that actually, facilitated, specifically authorized the deployment of troops pursuant to the initial proclamation. So it was the Insurrection Act in that way was a sort of guide, into the history and in that regard. That's number one. Number two is that although history is replete with, the use of federal troops in a variety of instances, that use is not always documented by, or doesn't necessarily always correspond, especially prior to the 20th century, with, specific, proclamations or orders, right? So there could very well, just a caveat, there could very well be other instances, particularly, prior to 1900, that could emerge, or be corroborated at some point. But the ones, after the 20th century and beyond are fairly clearly documented. So in any event, I'm sure many people first heard of the Insurrection Act, if they'd ever heard of it at all, last year at the end of May, I believe, 2020, when Donald Trump threatened to invoke it in order to respond to the George Floyd rebellion or the George Floyd uprisings, across the United States. And, it ultimately was not used in that instance, but, there was a lot of media attention around some of the other instances, like, for example, the Los Angeles riots that broke out after Rodney King's, the police officers who were involved in the savage beating of Rodney King were acquitted of certain charges. It was used to respond to riots that broke out in the DC, Chicago, and Baltimore after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. It was also used to protect the rights of civil rights protesters to march from Selma to Montgomery. This is in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, that widely televised confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It was used to respond and quell the Detroit riots of 1967 and 1943, as well as desegregate public schools in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. So, for example, the Little Rock Nine, right? These iconic events involving Black students, dramatically entering some of these public schools in the South, guarded by, troops, for the most part, National Guard troops that were federalized. These were Insurrection Act invocations. And then when you move further back, I go through a number of instances, but ones that I think are worth noting, for the time being are, the incident called Bleeding Kansas. And that's when there were pro and anti-slavery forces clashing in the then territory of Kansas in an effort to, determine whether that territory would be a free state or a slave state. And then, there were military, I saw a reference of a military historian who stated that one of the first instances that the Insurrection Act was used was in response to the Nat Turner Rebellion, one of the few, slave rebellions in the United States that actually got off to some kind of start before it was actually suppressed. And then arguably, I'd say to dispatch federal troops to Fort Sumter, marking the start of the Civil War. That's arguably an Insurrection Act invocation, just by looking at the actual language of the proclamation that was issued under the Lincoln administration. So, what's important about these incidents themselves is the pattern that they reveal, right? So I looked at all of this, and I took things a bit of a step further. I said, when you look at the invocations of the Insurrection Act, you see that for the most part, for the large part, it was used either to, suppress, violent eruptions around, slave powers and or, so-called race riots on the one hand, and to enforce the civil rights of African Americans on the other. So this pattern, in the book, I discussed how the Insurrection Act and the pattern that it reveals essentially holds up a mirror to the United States and basically shows how the battle to fully incorporate African Americans into the United States citizenry has not, necessarily been a rosy history of progress and enlightenment, but rather has been a sort of warlike contest, akin to even, a low-grade civil war, where the Insurrection Act and its invocations mark, certain flashpoints along the way.
And so in reading your book, I was particularly struck by the way in which the language of war appears, and the way you are also using the language of war and peace to re-describe or offer, a kind of, to characterize what otherwise is sort of euphemistically generally referred to as race, right, or race relations. And so you cite, for instance, John Locke, who invokes the law of war to justify slavery, right? It's the sort of captives of enemies who can be justly enslaved. You refer to the language of John Brown, or his lawyer, who argues that slavery itself, the institution, is itself a form of war, right? A barbarous and unprovoked and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another, right? And then, of course, the images of armored vehicles in Ferguson a couple of years ago, helicopters hovering over Washington, D.C., Lafayette Plaza. These images revealed to a lot of Americans some of the continuities. And what you're saying about the federal response and even state response in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, some of these images reveal the continuities between policing of Black Americans on the one hand and the assertion of U.S. military power against Black and Brown people in other parts of the world, right? That was what was suggested when people refer to tanks and Ferguson as Ferguson, right? And so I wanted to just again ask you to say a little bit more then about what your research on the Insurrection Act revealed to you about this dimension of U.S. racial history, right? How does it further complicate your own thinking about anti-Black racism or Beck's citizenship, right? Perhaps say a little bit more about what you mean by the paradoxical state of Black citizenship that's kind of revealed in your research. Maybe what does it reveal about the nature of sovereign power and its relationship to a citizenry, right? Which is kind of racially differentiated in the U.S. Those to me are some of the most revealing kind of insights that I got from your book.
Right. Well, I mean, in talking about war and peace, one thing that I do oftentimes in the book is pay very close attention to particular words and their definitions. Usually to, especially the shades of definitions that bring out and illuminate the ways in which these words reflect, like how we're engaging with them, as we're operating through this language, right? For lack of a better way of saying it. But, for example, peace is technically defined as the absence of war. So it's defined negatively. So it's not clear, technically what peace is, but we know that it's not, sort of open combat. And there's a way in which, this so-called negative peace, if it's not war, what is it? And in the book, I say that essentially the status quo, whatever that status quo is, right? So you have the status quo has a semblance of stability and order. That's another word that's has a lot of dimensions to it, law and order, right? So it's there's a way in which, a peaceful state of affairs or order really is, it's just a term that covers up what is, the latent violence implicated in the way that the system is constructed and maintained, right? So one scholar who I cite and was inspired by very heavily is Robert Cover. And he has this essay, it's called Violence and the Word. And in it, he basically says that legal interpretations occasion the use of violence upon other people. So for example, it's not just, police brutality, right? I mean, we can even talk at the level of fines or, tickets, fines, incarceration, other forms of, beat cop surveillance, etc. There's a way in which, what seems orderly or what seems like peace is really a form of a suppression of the violence that would be necessary to enforce, the disorder back into order if it were ever to arise. I mean, first of all, does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, and I think, even Robert Cover, I think he's beginning that essay by talking about the criminal justice system too, right? To sort of reanimate the violence of the word.
Right.
In that text.
Because if there's a way in which, law and order, there's like there's essentially a semblance of peace.
Mm-hmm.
But you step the wrong way, you make the wrong move, and then the violence will come at you one way or the other in order to put you back into your proper place, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
No. So I was going to say the continuities between war and peace, I think you kind of really illuminate. And I guess the thing that the Insurrection Act kind of brings into focus, because it authorizes this extraordinary use of federal power, military power. And what's so extraordinary about it and then revealing about it is that it exposes both the nature of sovereign power, right? The way in which sovereign power uses to maintain a peace,
Right.
whatever that looks like, but then also the pattern that you're describing, right? What's also revealed in your study of the Insurrection Act is that power seems to have been invoked, right? Extraordinary use of federal power in a domestic context. It's only really ever been invoked to police the racial line, right? And that's a shifting, it's the pattern you describe is curiously uneven, right? In that it seems to be invoked in the, through the Civil War or Reconstruction to manage or contain the threat of a slave rebellion, or Popper's rebellion, right? Something like that. But then very, shifts.
Right.
It shifts after the Civil War.
So you see the seesaw, and so just to follow up on this idea of order and peace and the latent violence that's implicated in order and peace, or what we call order and peace. So from the inception of slavery, right, through the Civil War, the order was the antebellum order. And, the order was focused on maintaining that system in place, right? So then you have emancipation, and then you have, the Civil Rights Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then we go to freedom, right? Formal freedom, the formal, granting of certain, constitutional rights, the formal induction of Black Americans into the citizenry, and that is the new order, right? So in the first order, there was violence essentially sanctioned in order to maintain the antebellum system. In the next order, you see, on the one hand, federal military power used to sort of, during the Reconstruction era, to sort of enforce the fledgling constitutional rights of freedmen, right? And then after Reconstruction, where there was that full drawback of federal military forces out of the South. The sort of, formal and, I guess essentially violent enforcement of those fledgling rights was no longer, facilitated. So then you had this sort of extra legal violence that arose to keep freedmen, in their place in the absence of this larger federal military administration. And that's where you start to see this pattern where you have this seesaw back and forth between enforcing civil rights, suppressing so-called race riots, because on the one hand, in the new order, right, there are formal entitlements, but they're only formal. They're not being actually fully realized in a meaningful way, which on the one hand can lead to the sort of anger and frustrations that erupt into race riots, so-called race riots. And then on the other can lead to certain, for example, the staunch segregationists or other, basically white vigilantes taking it upon themselves to, suppress the rights of Black Americans, and then the federal government would have to come in and to enforce these constitutional rights again. So you get that sort of seesaw effect. And then what I basically say is that that's the paradoxical state of Black citizenship. There's a sort of at some point I cite Wittgenstein and the duck rabbit effect, where you can look at a picture and then you look at it one way, it looks like a duck, and then you look at another way, it looks like a rabbit. There's that kind of like liminal sort of blurring effect when it comes to the Black citizen, which originally was an oxymoron at the founding of this country, and now is no longer technically an oxymoron. But through the invocation of the Insurrection Act, you can see how Black citizens are continuing to retain that earlier dual, the stigma of the dual status of being both property and person, right? And now that's, there's a dual status of being both ward and enemy of the state, right? So that's the reflection of this underlying instability in the system.
And as you're saying, maybe also impossibility, right? Black citizenship remains sort of formally promised but unrealized.
Right.
In a way,
it's becoming, right? It's in a state of becoming.
Okay, so I wanted to shift gears a little bit, and then I think also remind people in the audience that they can ask questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to shift gears a little bit to sort of invite you to say a little bit about how you've kind of constructed this project. I recognize this to be a powerful contribution to some of the ongoing conversations that we are having about history and memory, and the continuing relevance of slavery in contemporary life, how we make sense of the past, how, our reckoning with the past informs responsibility in the present. And you, in the book, write about your own early disenchantment with history as you encountered it in grade school. And I wanted to invite you to read some of those passages beginning on 81.
Okay, so I'll get started. And if how much time do you think I should do this for? Like 5 minutes? Oh?
Yeah, I think that passage on 81 and
okay,
a little bit, yeah.
Okay. So this is in the 3rd chapter, which discusses the Civil War largely. And the subtitle for this passage is Irrepressible Conflict. I never had much interest in history. The subject in and of itself was not the source of my disinclination. I was educated in a public school district in Suffolk County, Long Island, that was well-resourced, and for that reason drew residents to purchase homes in qualifying neighborhoods to ensure their children could attend one of the primary or secondary schools encompassed by the district. I am not ungrateful, but the entire experience was an ordeal. Much of the history I remember studying was presented under the moniker of social studies, a catch-all for certain fields of learning, including history and geography that, unlike, say, math or English, didn't neatly fit into other disciplines within the school's curricula. As a proverbial only Black kid in my class, I dreaded social studies class in part because whenever the teacher would make mention of the word slave or slavery, several of the white kids would turn to glance or outright stare at me. I would sit there at my desk on the receiving end of these looks and awkwardly pretend I wasn't being forced on display. Whatever we were discussing at that given moment was clearly causing the white kids to feel uncomfortable, and their immediate response was to project that discomfort onto me. I didn't have the vocabulary at the time for this silent interaction laced with malevolence, but I remember how I felt, ashamed. I didn't know what I felt ashamed about, again, as I then lacked the words to name the source of my feelings. However, what was being made clear with the uttering of the word slave or slavery and the almost accusatory stares in my direction was that my present day being was directly associated with enslavement, a badge of inferiority that was mine and mine alone to carry. Whenever slavery was discussed in those classrooms, not only could I count on the stares, but also this teacher's reassurance that we, meaning all of us present day beings learning social studies at that very moment, should not judge those historical enslavers by our contemporary morals. I never felt included in that we, the balm of historical relativism, which seemed intended to soothe the potentially guilty consciences of the white kids who managed to thereby distance themselves from the karma of any ancestral enslavers while pinning the burdens of slavery and the enslaved onto me. Historical relativism buttressed their sense of innocence, while their glares in my direction seemed to project some kind of guilt. So, and then next, yeah, I'll go to the next, I'll do 85.
Yeah.
Beyond the context in which I was supposed to be learning history, the subject matter itself presented barriers to my early willingness to engage with it. My grade school encounters with history consisted of names, dates, notable events, and geographical locations that I was compelled to memorize from textbooks and recite on test day, and which then, frankly, would promptly evaporate from my mind. The textbook presentation of history as a simplified, sanitized list of chronological factoids, largely devoid of narrative, is, of course, intentional. The project of teaching history is inextricable from the project of imprinting students with a sense of nationalistic identity and patriotic fidelity. And this project, at its core, is paradoxical, as it is guided by a single self-contradictory intention: to teach what happened in the past without really teaching what happened in the past. It is a mission that is ultimately impossible. Should I stop there?
No, I think let's keep doing one more, starting at the top and 90, just those two.
Okay.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I think
Concurrent with historical erasure is the selective imparting of facts, omitting whatever is disruptive to the sanitized nationalistic portrayal of history while including and highlighting whatever bolsters it. I'm particularly stubborn about filtering out and selectively ignoring anything that I can tell is being aggressively marketed to me. All those swan songs to freedom-fighting founding fathers I repeatedly came across in a variety of media were, time and again, deflected by my own self-protective, willful ignorance. I just did not want to know. Though I was repeatedly being taught what happened, when whatever happened, who did what and to whom, what was missing was why. Why were these things happening? Without this distinct perspective, without any narrative through line, I was simply unable to care about this so-called history. Any reckoning with the why or any avoidable facts, like the existence of slaves or slavery, were mollified by historical relativism and that useful yet illusory notion of progress, overshadowing a violent past with both the evidence and the promise of a bright future.
Thank you. So I just want to then invite you to say a little bit about how some of that early encounter, disenchantment, skepticism about textbook history has shaped or informed your own retelling of this history.
Well, honestly, it was definitely, well, first I'll start off with saying that I have a law degree. So as you said, I'm in the priesthood, right? But I am not a historian. So I felt like I had the license to just, jump in and think about why a lot of these events I was, reading about and researching about why they were happening. What were the deeper implications? What are the deeper motivations? So it was sort of like filling in this vacuum that was left, frankly, in my learning of history. Even beyond into college, I took like another history class, and I felt the same way. I felt as if I was just memorizing events. Like I never felt like I got deeper. Clearly, I didn't go on to graduate studies in history, but it was just interesting how, at least from my public school education, and then going on to higher education and taking at least one history class, I still felt that deep sense of lack around that basic understanding, which is where I think narrative comes in. Right? You need to connect these events, or at least, situate them into some sort of larger story. Because even as the particular events fade away, the story remains, and it's actually more important in a lot of ways than the facts. And I think there are people who fully understand that. And I don't think the way I learned history in grade school was by any means an oversight. I think it's designed to sort of, at least at that level, particularly the public schools, it's drained of, any kind of controversy, any kind of sense of, storyline that could potentially, be subversive, right? So yes,
yeah. And two problems with history. One is the somehow desiccated, presentation of desiccated facts, right? That's one that I also recognize from my own encounter with history in high school. And then another is about the implicit narratives, I suppose, and those are what are being contested now, because as especially what comes through in some of your personal narratives is the tension between the official narrative of progress on the one hand, right, where things have a kind of, positive trajectory, and then the uncanny feeling that you describe in some of your anecdotes, right, of kind of reliving a history that you cannot be an agent of over and over again. But then I guess I wanted to also suggest too, with that first sort of shortcoming in the way history is told, one of the ways in which I think you're offering a corrective is by engaging with feeling, right? Especially fear, white anxiety. Your own anger does a lot of work, a kind of controlled anger, right? A really controlled anger does a lot of work also in kind of reanimating these histories. So there's one moment early in the book where you describe listening to two historians talk about the antebellum period. And you describe a younger historian who identifies white fear of a slave insurrection as hastening the Civil War in so many ways. And the older historian rejects this account, right? That fear can be a subject or agent of history. But in your own composition, I see fear, cognitive dissonance as a term appears, some of these feelings emerge as the agents who help us make sense of some of this history. And I just wanted to, invite you to say a little bit about, the composition of your
right.
of your story. Yeah.
So basically, I was tasked with, I tasked myself largely, but I was also tasked, thankfully, thanks to my editor, Elaine Mason at Norton. She suggested that I write this in a hybrid style. And, I had pitched the Insurrection Act and, the more, theoretical aspects and, being given the opportunity to interweave these, personal narrative and some, philosophical perspectives, etc., was very exciting to me, but it was also very daunting because I didn't know how I was going to connect any of these together. So this, the themes that arise, particularly in the first chapter, like you said, fear, the second chapter, silence, the third chapter, cognitive dissonance, the fourth chapter, mob psychology, right? They ended up being arising out of the necessity of finding a way to connect seemingly disparate passages. So I just needed a theme for every chapter. And so I just allowed the material to show me what the theme was, essentially. I didn't try to impose these themes, who knows, I might have to some extent, but they seem to come out of the actual material itself. And then that allowed me to figure out which anecdotes were useful and sort of put it all together in a way that wouldn't seem too disjointed to the reader, so that even as they were reading, even if it took some time to sort of gather how all of these disparate pieces fit together, by the end of the chapter, at the very least, it will leave you with a feeling, right? Feelings, right? I know we don't talk about feelings in academia, but they exist. and again, I had license to sort of excavate that aspect, like the sort of emotional aspect of a lot of these incidents, and sort of bring them to the fore through these sort of thematic linkages in each chapter.
No, and I think it's very effective, and I do think since you're talking about the composition and the interleaving of your own voice and these vignettes, it does do a lot of work to sort of explain, again, like the contemporary relevance of some of this history, right? And the way in which these histories, which can seem dusty, in the way that they're presented in textbooks, are actually felt and lived in ways that are sometimes inaudible, sometimes silenced, to use another language, but otherwise inarticulate, but still active as feeling and embodied in so many ways, right? So anyway,
and that's interesting, because I think my hope was that the reader would come away not only with that sense of these events having resonance in the present, but also being able to maybe fill in their own experiences into some of these gaps, because through these themes, because the feeling aspect is the thing that is going to be the most relatable, as opposed to this fact and that fact, and this invocation and whatnot. But I think that's I think I would hope would be the hook that would draw the reader in to the material.
I'm starting to see questions pop up. So shall we turn to those? I have one or two questions for you about the writer, but we can turn to some of these. So one person asked, what do you want the reader to take away from the book? And I think you started to answer that. So you can say more about that if you want. Here's a related pair of questions I'll just pose to you. What was the hardest part of the book for you to write? What was the easiest? That's one question. And another is, what surprised you most in researching for the book?
Okay. Well, yes, definitely the takeaway I would, hope that a reader would be, finding, being invited to sort of situate yourself into this historical narrative and see ways in which, maybe the more mundane aspects of your everyday life are nonetheless sort of resurrecting these ghosts from long past, right? So that's what I was tasked with doing in writing this, but it's by no means the final word on any of this material. So I would hope that the reader could do some of this work themselves, and maybe as they go about their daily lives, they say, oh wait, that reminds me of this particular event, or this has like a similar theme, and again, it's the theme, I think, that does the most work in making the material actually relevant to the reader, as opposed to the actual particular events, right? So what was the hardest part for me to write? Well, I think it was just, I think the most challenging part really was just grounding myself in a lot of the research, because I had to cover a lot of ground. Luckily, I had the Insurrection Act related incidents as anchors to focus my inquiry. But again, I was not, a history major or a history, any kind of history buff by any means. So that it was actually quite a lot of research that I did just to feel confident enough to then, to give myself the license to, decide what all of it really meant. So that was quite challenging. And the easiest part was definitely the personal narrative, a lot of which, or some of which is, somewhat irreverent. You'll find different voices in the book. So, that to me, it was a little bit of a break from the more weighty material. And hopefully for the reader would be a way of, first of all, just giving them a break as well. But, allowing them to sort of relate to the material in a more, I guess, in a lighter way, a lighter fashion, right? While still allowing the themes to come home. So, but that was the easiest and probably the most fun.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed reading those in particular, as I've said to you, and it's not just that they're lighter. I think they also they do cover some distance, right? They do sort of make more immediate, let's say, some of this history, right, in ways that it's not always easy to connect the dots, but I think a reader can recognize that. Let me see another question. I mean, I have a question for you related while I look at these, some of these questions. So you are a lawyer also, since we've already talked about some of the different voices that enter this narrative, or, that do the work of telling here. So you're a lawyer. You and I met as recent graduates, law graduates, bruised and disenchanted and wounded by the experience of law school. And so, you talk about, you remember moments as a law clerk and as a law firm associate. So I just wanted to, ask you how some of that experience also enters, your telling. And yeah, as we sort of said, you're kind of the priesthood, but you sound like somebody who has lost faith or harbors skepticism, which is totally appropriate. And so, how are you positioning yourself in relation to legal authority, right?
Right.
Or the conventions of, legal narrative and legal authority?
Well, I think there are a lot of people, I would say a lot of people, I haven't done a poll, but I would say there's a fairly common experience of going to law school and feeling somewhat overwhelmed, not only by the amount of work and studying you have to do. I mean, that's one thing, but there's a sense in which you are being broken down and then built back up in order to be a sort of functionary and a sort of agent of an officer of the law, right? That's what we are. And in that way, your voice, doesn't really matter in that context. What matters is, what does the case law say? What does the statute say? What is the relevant rule and standard? What are the relevant facts? If there's a fact that's relevant to you, law student, that doesn't matter. If it's not relevant to the particular case at hand, you have to throw it out, right? So, I mean, it's actually it's training, right? It's basic training, it's useful training.
It's discipline.
It's discipline, exactly. But it can seem very overwhelming, particularly when you're discussing issues that are important to you, right? Because you go to law school being fairly idealistic, thinking that these are tools that you can use to, hopefully change the world, this, that, and the other, right? But there's a way in which, at least I came to an understanding that there is a sort of entrenched sort of modus operandi that is effectively reestablishing itself and reasserting itself. And, there are moments where, there are, these watershed cases or these landmark cases where things change. But, as, a lot of people other than myself, would point out, that would seem largely in response to cultural shifts that that perhaps certain judges are responding to without being able to telegraph that they're actually responding to them, right? When you're dealing with the law, you're dealing with a system that of precedent where that you have to sort of apply what has come before. So it's essentially a conservative enterprise, right? It's not for mavericks, really, in my opinion, or and it's certainly not for people who are trying to assert their own voice in the midst of all of that. So in a way, I mean, I think coming out of that background, like this book it's actually sort of, therapeutic in some ways, because I was able to sort of interact with, this legal history using my actual voice, right? And not just this, sort of, just speaking about the material from outside of the legal system and not sort of within it and like tinkering around and feeling constrained.
I have two sort of related lawyerish questions. One comes from, I gather, a law student. What advice do you have for younger lawyers looking to embark on an ambitious academic project like this? That's one question. And the other is a little bit more straightforwardly law question.
Okay.
So I'll just read it slowly for you. Are there any safeguards against the president's arbitrary invocation of the act? Would Congress or the courts have any recourse had Trump used the act to quell the George Floyd protests?
Okay.
So those are two questions that you can answer, and there are others too.
Okay. So for the first question, honestly, with this particular project, this was not something I could have planned. I did not go into this thinking, let me come up with an ambitious project, and this was an organic unfolding of following my curiosity. So essentially, that is the advice I would give you. Is really, if there's something that piques your interest, something that prompts you to keep digging, to keep looking further, just do that and see where that leads you. Because I don't think, there's no way that I would have ever thought that I would have come across this material when I started, looking around, with respect to Hurricane Katrina. So that's number one. So number two, in terms of the safeguards, well, interestingly, first of all, the act was passed in 1807. It was a very different time in terms of legislation. The legislation was relatively sparse. It wasn't as verbose and as laden as the legislation you would see, enacted now. But that said, there was a bill introduced in the House after the Donald Trump threatened to invoke it, basically intending to assert congressional oversight over the Insurrection Act invocation, basically asking or requesting that the president engage with Congress and make a request, laying forth why the act should be invoked, and then also setting forth certain time parameters during which these active deployments would be sanctioned. But it was introduced in the House. It never went any further than that. As of now, it's still as fairly sparse as it had been before.
Okay. I have one final question for you, I think, because we're coming up on an hour. Well, I'll give you a choice. Okay.
Okay.
So one, as I've sort of shared with you, some of my favorite passages in the book are when you are engaging with white interlocutors, and these are sometimes they're failed exchanges. So for instance, you talk about voting 2008 for Obama, and the day you cast your vote for Obama, you walked around New York City making eye contact with a number of white liberals who were smiling at you. And it's just a sort of, it's funny. And and it's sort of pregnant with a lot of understated meaning. And I guess I just was, I'm interested to know what you're doing in some of those passages and how you're situating yourself in relation to different readers. So that's one question. You can choose to answer that one, or that's just a compliment. the second question is sort of related to some of what you've been saying, right? And which is that I know that you've had this book on your mind for a very long time, but you kind of wrapped up the writing of it, or maybe you spent most of your time writing during this last couple of years of pandemic, Trump, mass protests, and I guess I'm wondering what it was like to write during this period. What it was like to kind of work on this project during that period.
Okay. Well, I'll give a short answer to your first question. And, frankly, I don't think when I was writing those passages, I was particularly conscious of, how they would be interpreted by a given reader. But I think, in looking back, I think what I was doing is, I'm writing a book about race, right? And that is, there's a genre of that book. And I think I was, very conscious about that, but also, sort of trying to, sort of subvert that at the same time. And, in some ways, allow myself to, to make statements like that, which could very well implicate, a certain kind of reader in ways that are not entirely comfortable. So, so I'm aware that it has that effect, but, I just, in writing a book about race, I wanted to also avoid writing a book about race, right? Is that suffice as a short answer?
This is not a book about becoming.
And then, what was your second question? Oh, the pandemic.
So writing during the pandemic, and not just pandemic, everything that's kind of
everything. Okay. So yeah, I had a lot of the material on my mind, but in terms of, what I was tasked with, like interweaving the personal narrative, this, that, and the other, frankly, I think a lot of people were sort of stupefied by the Trump election. It was just a lot to get, situated, like to get used to in various ways. So I just, it took me a while to sort of get grounded and figure out how I was going to approach this material in this context. So when I was sort of a third of the way through, the pandemic hit, which obviously afforded me a lot of silence, a lack of FOMO, right? So at that time, I happened to decide to read the Bible, just from cover to cover. And as it turned out, each of my chapters have headings that are pulled from the Bible itself, which ended up being very fortuitous because it sort of implicitly relates to this idea of man's law and, say natural law, or this other divine law that is at play, and there's that intention with man's law, and this tug of war over which one is supreme, which then also speaks to these themes about, for example, Black activists breaking, these Southern laws, segregationist laws, or, a Nat Turner or Gabriel Prosser rising up, rising up in order to gain their own liberation, right? They're appealing to a different authority. They're dealing to authority that is not, man's law, right? So in that way, just having the time and space to sort of read the Bible again ended up featuring into the text. But, obviously I did not expect Donald Trump to then threaten to invoke the act, that in response to the George Floyd rebellion, or later on for the word insurrection to become a sort of household colloquial term. So it was as if, in the beginning of the writing, and towards the end of the writing, Trump, who started off being a sort of forming himself into a sort of writer's block for me, ended up facilitating the material and making me see, the themes illuminated even, in a much sort of expanded scale that I couldn't have imagined at the beginning. So that's pretty much my personal experience of writing it largely during that time.
Thank you. I see. Hosts are back.
Yeah, great moderating, Sherally. And Hawa, what a wonderful example of what can happen when a writer follows her curiosity. Thanks to you, we now have a revealing history of this powerful centuries-old act and its application, as you say, its seesaw use over the years along racial lines. And by weaving in your own experiences and voice, you've given this history considerable resonance in the present. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Insurrection. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.